Hi, Paratown Weather Meteorologist Paul Dorian here on Thursday morning, August 12th. We'll focus in on what remains of Tropical Storm Fred. Indeed, it weakened in the overnight hours, now a tropical depression, as it had an encounter with the landmass of Hispaniola. There's some high terrain in the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and oftentimes that high terrain can disrupt the low-level circulation around a tropical system and weaken the system, and indeed that has happened to Fred. However, it is now over the open waters of the southwestern Atlantic and could very well intensify over the next several hours, likely to reach at least the southern part of Florida by the day on Saturday, maybe the Florida Keys, maybe a little bit farther to the north and east than the Florida Keys in the southern part of Florida, but indeed it could undergo some intensification before that time, and then likely spill out over the eastern part of the Gulf of Mexico as it heads northward towards the Florida Panhandle. Could make a landfall Florida Panhandle region by the early part of next week. First of all, let's take a look at the latest visible satellite imagery loop from the College of DuPage weather website. Here's a little bit of a circulation associated with tropical depression Fred. And again, it was weakened by its encounter with the higher terrain of the Dominican Republic and Haiti. Oftentimes that happens. This is the northern coast of Cuba, and right now it looks like it'll continue on a west-northwest track, mostly out over the open waters now as it heads towards the Florida Straits. Water temperatures are quite supportive of intensification here, and it very likely can re-intensify back into tropical storm status by the time it reaches the Florida Keys or the southern part of Florida by the day on Saturday. Well, let's take a look at the latest positioning by NOAA's National Hurricane Center of not one but two different systems in the Atlantic Basin. First of all, here is what remains of Fred after it had an encounter. Right here is Hispaniola. That's Dominican Republic on the right side, the eastern side, and Haiti on the western side of that island. Has some high terrain. Fred was a tropical storm. Certainly had some kind of a disruption to the low-level circulation, now weakened to a tropical depression. However, as we stated up front, it is now back out over the open waters of the southwestern Atlantic. Looks like it'll head right towards the Florida Straits over the next 24 to 48 hours or so, likely reaching this area, the Florida Keys or another part of southern Florida, by the day on Saturday. Meanwhile, there is a second system on its heels, very likely to move in a similar track to the west-northwest over the next few days. It could head over the same kind of a region, and we may have to be dealing with that system somewhere in the Gulf of Mexico later next week. Meanwhile, the track of Fred beyond this point looks like it'll go over the eastern part of the Gulf of Mexico, then perhaps reach the Florida Panhandle region right here by, let's say, early Monday, the early part of next week. And then after that, there are signs that it could turn right to the north and east and kind of meander its way up through the eastern states during the week next week, the middle and latter part of next week. That's a little bit unsure. It's well out into the future at this particular point. And one thing I want to note, and we'll see this in a moment here, the winds will be very weak in the upper part of the atmosphere next week in the eastern U.S., and that allows for a slow movement. It allows for all kinds of possibilities. Perhaps it could turn up the coast for a while, not the coast, but inland for a while, and then kind of loop back around. I mean, it's still a lot of questions that have to be answered about next week. But this is a potential track right here over the Florida Keys by Saturday, then the western part of Florida by early Monday, maybe the Panhandle region or the Big Bend region, and then perhaps turning north-northeast through the inland sections of the eastern U.S. next week. Well, let's focus in on the upper air pattern, the all-important upper air pattern that will not only dictate where Fred ends up moving, but also the intensity of Fred. There are some worrisome signs that it could very well intensify as it approaches the U.S., specifically in this case Florida. There could be a ridge of high pressure kind of developing overhead just before it has an encounter with Florida, and that could allow for some intensification by the early part of the weekend over southern Florida, and maybe again by the latter part of the weekend or early part of next week by the time it reaches up to the Panhandle region. But first of all, upper level troughs situated over southern Canada as we begin the day, and some upper level ridging up across the northeast. Watch what happens to the overall pattern as we go through the next several days. And this is a key to the forecast for Fred. This is now Saturday. Notice rather light winds showing up here in the upper part of the atmosphere over the Gulf of Mexico region. Sea surface temperatures are plenty warm to support intensification, plenty warm to support a hurricane and potentially even a major hurricane this time of the year. But the high pressure ridging just really intensifies over the southeastern part of Canada. This is now going into Monday and finally by Tuesday. And notice again, very few lines showing up here in the eastern part of the U.S., the southeastern states. A weak wind field aloft, and that will certainly favor the idea of a slow movement of Fred. Again, anticipating it to move just north of the Cuban coastline over the next 24 to 48 hours or so, then head right to the Florida Keys or perhaps the southern tip of Florida, likely then over the eastern Gulf of Mexico, then into the western part of Florida by the early part of next week, and after that probably inland, probably pushing north and northeast, and could bring some rain all the way up through the eastern states later next week. Let's go out even farther in time, and look at this thing forming here over the southeastern part of Canada. This is by the middle of next week, and remember, at this time we'll also be looking at that other system out over the eastern Atlantic. Very well could take a similar path, and it could end up in the central Gulf of Mexico later next week. That's the second system. At this time, Fred, or whatever remains of Fred, will likely be up in this part of the continental U.S. here. But again, remember, there's that second system on its heels, and strong high pressure ridging setting up over the southeastern part of Canada. We've talked about this at length over the last couple of weeks. High pressure ridging, southeastern Canada this time of the year, opens the door for tropical systems to move from the east to the west right into the Bahamas, Florida, the Gulf of Mexico, and indeed this is the area of concern going forward. Well, I wanted to wrap up by taking a look at the European model. I think it has a little better handle than the GFS right now on Fred, what is likely to be intensify back into tropical storm status probably relatively quickly within the next 12 to 24 hours or so. But this is the forecast map for this evening. And let's just move ahead in 24-hour increments here. Here we go now by Saturday evening. Here is likely to be the position of Fred, somewhere from the Florida Keys to the southern part of Florida, the tip of Florida perhaps, by late in the day on Saturday. And from there, 24 hours later, probably slides over the extreme eastern part of the Gulf of Mexico right towards the Panhandle region of Florida by the early part of next week. At that point, could go inland, turn northward, and push right through the eastern states. And again, watch out for potential intensification right in this region here. Unfortunately, before it can impact Florida, it could have some intensification. There's a couple of possibilities that, first of all, the sea surface temperature is plenty warm in that part of the Gulf of Mexico, and signs that an upper level ridge could form right over the southeastern states over the weekend. That will reduce wind shear, help with the prospects for intensification in the last, let's say, 12 to 24 hours before it makes landfall in likely the western part of Florida. Let's go out another 24 hours, and by this time, whatever remains of Fred is liable to be up across the middle Atlantic region, let's say by the middle part of next week. And certainly could bring some decent rainfall up through the eastern states next week. But before we get there, watch out in southern Florida. It is likely to intensify over the next 12, 24, 36 hours or so. reaching the Florida Keys or another part of the southern Florida by the early part of the upcoming week, and then likely the western part of Florida by the early part of next week. That's it for now. From ParatonWeather.com, I'm meteorologist Paul Dorian.